Of course, you have heard about vampires. You may know the myths and legends, but why are these creatures so fascinating to us? After all, they were feared for thousands of years. They have been depicted as charming, rich, and powerful individuals, but in other cultures and civilizations, they were horrible, bloodthirsty creatures. Today, we will find out the legend of the vampire. When you hear the word vampire, maybe you think of Damon Salvatore, Edward Cullen, Eric Northman, or maybe you think about Dracula, Elizabeth Bathory, or Nosferatu. All of them are very different, but they have something in common. They have captivated the world, maybe is because of their physical strength, mental abilities like hypnosis, or just the thought of being immortal and living forever. Today, we're going to talk about the history of vampires, those bloodthirsty creatures of the night that have fascinated and terrified people for centuries. But where did they come from? How did they evolve? And why are they so popular in fiction and media? I would like to ask you before we explore further, would you like to be a vampire? If the answer is yes, why? Would it be because of the physical strength, the mental power, or just the fact that you will have other people's lives in your hands? The word vampire comes from the Slavic term upir, which means to drink. And it appeared in English in 1734, derived from the French word vampire and the German word vampire. However, the concept of vampiric creatures predates the specific term vampire by centuries. The earliest references to vampires date back to ancient Mesopotamia, where they were believed to be demons that preyed on the living. Similar creatures were also found in other cultures, such as the Chinese Zhang Shi, the Greek Lamia, the Egyptian Akh, and the Indian Vetala. These beings were usually depicted as corpses that rose from their graves to feed on human or animal blood, often spreading diseases and curses along the way. The concept of blood-drinking creatures or entities can be found in various ancient mythologies and folklore from different cultures. While it is challenging to pinpoint an exact first record, one of the earliest mentions of blood-drinking creatures can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamian mythology. In Mesopotamia, the civilization of Sumer gave rise to the legend of Lilitu or Lilith, a female demon associated with nocturnal activities and considered to be a threat to both men and children. Lilith was often depicted as a blood-drinking entity and was believed to prey upon infants and young children. This concept of a supernatural creature feeding on blood and exhibiting vampiric characteristics can be traced back to around 3000 BCE. It's important to note that similar legends and myths involving blood-drinking creatures can also be found in other ancient civilizations, such as ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and various indigenous cultures worldwide. These early narratives laid the foundation for the evolution of vampire folklore throughout history. The modern concept of vampires, however, emerged in Europe during the Middle Ages, when outbreaks of plague and tuberculosis caused mass hysteria and superstition. People began to associate these diseases with vampirism and started to dig up graves to look for signs of undead activity. Some of these signs included bloated bodies, blood around the mouth, nails and hair growth, and lack of decomposition. Of course, these were all natural phenomena that occurred after death, but people didn't know that at the time. They thought they had found real vampires and proceeded to stake them, burn them, or decapitate them to prevent them from rising again. One of the most famous cases of alleged vampirism was that of Arnold Pale, a Serbian soldier who died in 1725. He claimed that he had been bitten by a vampire while serving in the Ottoman Empire, and that he had cured himself by eating soil from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with its blood. However, after his death, several people in his village died of a mysterious illness, and Powell was blamed for it. His body was exhumed and found to be fresh and full of blood. He was staked through the heart, but his corpse reportedly groaned and bled profusely. His body was then burned, along with 4 other suspected vampires. The story of Powell sparked a wave of vampire hysteria across Europe, and inspired many writers and artists to create their own versions of the undead. One of the most influential works was Dracula, a novel by Bram Stoker published in 1897. Stoker based his character on Vlad Tepes, a 15th century Wallachian prince who was notorious for his cruelty and impalement of his enemies. Stoker also added elements from folklore and mythology, such as garlic, crosses, sunlight, and bats. Dracula became a classic of Gothic literature and spawned countless adaptations. Today, vampires are still a popular subject of fiction and media, but they have also undergone some changes. Some modern vampires are more sympathetic and romantic than their predecessors, such as those in Twilight or the Vampire Diaries. Some are more humorous, such as those in What We Do in the Shadows or Hotel Transylvania. And some are more complex, such as those in True Blood. Whatever their form or style, vampires continue to captivate our imagination and challenge our notions of life and death. But not everything we think we know about vampires is true. There are many myths and misconceptions that have been perpetuated by fiction and media over the years. For example, something we hear quite a lot is that vampires can't see their reflection in mirrors. This myth originated from the belief that mirrors reflect the soul, which vampires supposedly lack. However, this is not true for all types of mirrors. For instance, silver mirrors would not reflect vampires because silver is a holy metal that repels evil. But glass mirrors would reflect them just fine. Another famous myth is that vampires can't enter a house without an invitation. This myth stems from the idea that vampires are bound by certain respect for human free will. However, some vampires can enter any place they want by using their hypnotic powers or brute force. Others can enter only if they have a connection to someone inside, such as a relative or a lover. What about wooden stakes? This myth is based on the practice of staking corpses to prevent them from rising as vampires. However, some vampires can only be killed by specific materials or methods, such as silver bullets or sunlight. Others can regenerate from any injury or even detach parts of their body. Something common among vampires is immortality. This is derived from the fact that vampires do not age or die of natural causes. Some vampires have a limited lifespan or can be killed by certain events or conditions, such as a prophecy or a curse. Others can choose to end their existence or become human again. Vampires have been around for a long time, but they have not always been the glamorous and romantic creatures we see in movies and books today. In fact, for most of history, vampires were feared and hated as the cause of deadly epidemics that swept across the world. Here are some of the most notorious vampire outbreaks in history and how people tried to stop them. The first recorded vampire epidemic was in ancient Mesopotamia, where people believed that evil spirits called Ekimu could possess the bodies of the dead and drain the life force of the living. To prevent this, they would bury their dead with stakes, stones, or clay pots in their mouths to keep the Ekimu from escaping. Then in medieval Europe, the plague was blamed on vampires who spread the disease by biting and infecting people. To identify and destroy these vampires, people would dig up graves and look for signs of blood, bloating, or fresh hair and nails on the corpses. If they found any, they would burn, behead, or stake the bodies to end their undead existence. Again, in 19th century New England, a tuberculosis outbreak was attributed to vampires who sucked the blood and vitality of their family members. One of the most well-known victims was Mercy Brown, a young girl who died of the disease in 1892. Her father, convinced that she was a vampire, had her body dug up and burned her heart and liver to stop her from harming her surviving brother. In modern times, vampires are still a source of fascination and fear for many people, especially with the emergence of new diseases like AIDS. Some people believe that these viruses are transmitted by vampires or that they are part of a conspiracy to create a vampire army, which is an interesting point of view. But I personally don't believe this one. Others see vampires as a metaphor for social issues like racism, sexism, or classism. And some just enjoy the fantasy of being immortal, powerful, and seductive. As you can see, vampires have been a part of human history for millennia, and they will probably continue to be for many more. Whether they are real or not, they reflect our deepest fears and desires, and they challenge us to confront our own mortality and morality. We've discussed vampirism in Elder Civilization and in Europe, but what about vampires from the rest of the world? Africa is a continent with a rich and diverse history of vampirism, dating back to ancient times. Some of the earliest vampire legends come from Africa, such as the Asenbosum, a creature with iron teeth that hangs from trees and bites unsuspecting travelers, or the Ads, a firefly-like spirit that can possess people and drain their blood. African vampires are often associated with witchcraft, curses, and diseases, and are feared by many. Some of them can shapeshift into animals or humans, while others are undead corpses that rise from their graves at night. Some of the ways to ward off or kill African vampires are garlic, salt, iron, fire, or driving a stake through their heart. Australia has a relatively recent history of vampirism, as it was colonized by Europeans in the 18th century. The first vampire sightings in Australia were reported by convicts and settlers who encountered strange creatures in the outback, such as the Yara Maya Hu, a red-furred humanoid with suckers on its hands and feet that swallows its victims whole and regurgitates them alive, or the drop bear, a large carnivorous koala that drops from trees and attacks unsuspecting tourists. Australian vampires are often influenced by European folklore, such as the Dracula myth or the Gothic literature genre, and are seen as romantic, mysterious, and seductive. Some of them are immortal aristocrats who live in secluded mansions, while others are rebellious outcasts who roam the streets at night. Some of the ways to ward off or kill Australian vampires are sunlight, holy water, crosses, silver, or decapitation. New Zealand has a unique history of vampirism, as it was influenced by both Maori and European cultures. The first vampire legends in New Zealand come from Maori mythology, such as the Patupaiarehe, or the Taniwha, a water-dwelling monster that can take various forms and prey on humans. New Zealand vampires are often portrayed as comedic, quirky, and friendly, and are not taken very seriously by most people. Some of them are ancient warriors who have adapted to modern life, while others are ordinary citizens who have been turned into vampires by accident. Some of the ways to ward off or kill New Zealand vampires are garlic bread, werewolves, and stakes made of wood from native trees, not imported ones. Vampires in South America are influenced by indigenous European, African, and Asian cultures. The first vampire stories in South America come from indigenous folklore, such as the chupacabra, a goat-sucking beast that terrorizes farmers and livestock, or the pishtaco, a pale-skinned cannibal that cuts off the fat of its victims and sells it as soap. South American vampires are often associated with magic, religion, and politics, and are revered by some and hated by others. Some of them are powerful sorcerers who can control the elements or summon spirits, while others are oppressed minorities who fight for their rights or survival. There are many reasons why vampires are relevant to our society. They represent our fears and our desires. They're creatures of the night, they're immortal, and they have superhuman strength and speed. They're also often seductive and charismatic. Vampires can be seen as a metaphor for our own mortality. They remind us that death is always lurking in the shadows, and that we can never truly escape it. But they also represent our fear of the unknown. They're creatures of the night, and we don't know what they're capable of. At the same time, vampires can also be seen as a source of desire. They're often portrayed as being incredibly beautiful, and they have a certain allure that can be hard to resist. They can also offer us eternal life, which is something that many people would find appealing. They are complex creatures that represent both our fears and our desires. They're a reminder of our mortality, but they are also a source of temptation. They're creatures of the night, but they're also creatures of myth and legend. That's why vampires are so relevant to our society. They're a part of our collective unconscious, and they continue to fascinate us because they tap into our deepest fears and desires. Now that we know some stories and origins of vampires, we can talk about the symptoms of vampirism. The symptoms varied and often based on superstition and folklore. Some of the most common symptoms included sensitivity to sunlight. Vampires were often said to be unable to tolerate sunlight and would either burst into flames or turn to dust if they were exposed to it. Also, receding gums and fangs. It was believed that vampires' gums would recede, exposing their fangs, which they would use to drink the blood of their victims. Pale skin was generally a symptom or a signal of vampirism. Vampires were often said to have pale skin, which was thought to be a sign that they were undead. Aversion to garlic was believed that vampires were repelled by garlic, and that if they were to eat it, they would be killed. People used to believe that they had the ability to transform into bats, wolves, or other animals in order to travel undetected. It is important to note that there is no scientific evidence to support the existence of vampires. The symptoms listed are simply superstitions that have been passed down through the centuries. However, they do provide an interesting glimpse into the way that people in the past viewed death and the supernatural. There were also a number of other factors that could lead someone to be suspected of vampirism in old times. These included sudden death, If someone died suddenly, without any obvious cause, they might be suspected of being a vampire. Unusual behavior, if someone was behaving strangely, or if they were seen out at night, they might be suspected of being a vampire. Dreaming about the undead, if someone had a dream about being attacked by a vampire, they might start to believe that they were actually being haunted by one. Of course, not everyone who was suspected of being a vampire was actually one. In many cases, people were accused of vampirism out of fear or superstition. However, the belief in vampires was so strong in some cultures that even the slightest hint of suspicion could lead to a person's death. Now we can examine vampirism in a scientific point of view, even though I fully believe in vampires. The belief that vampires drink blood may have originated from the practice of exhuming bodies. When a body decomposes, it releases a fluid that can look like blood. Without an understanding of decomposition, it's easy to see how people could have mistaken this fluid for blood and believed that the body was drinking it. Another possible explanation for the vampire myth is porphyria. Porphyria is a rare blood disorder that can cause sensitivity to sunlight, skin lesions, and even mental disturbances. In the past, people with porphyria may have been mistaken for vampires because of their pale skin and aversion to sunlight. While there is no scientific evidence to support the existence of vampires, these myths can be traced back to real-world phenomena. By understanding the science behind these myths, we can better appreciate how they came to be and why they continue to fascinate us today. There is no scientific evidence to support the existence of vampires. However, there have been many reports of vampire sightings throughout history. These reports often describe creatures that are pale-skinned, have sharp teeth, and drink blood. The vampire myth is a fascinating part of human culture, and it will continue to be told and retold for generations to come. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe for more creepy content. And don't forget to comment below. What are some other vampire myths that you know or want to learn more about? What do you think about vampires? Are they real? Where are they? And most importantly, will we ever discover the truth?